For centuries, we've been told that ancient Greece was the birthplace of philosophy, science, and higher knowledge. That wisdom suddenly appeared, fully formed in the minds of Greek thinkers. But the Greeks themselves told a different story. Before the great names, before Plato, before Pythagoras, before philosophy had a language, there was Egypt. Greek scholars didn't just admire Egyptian wisdom. They traveled thousands of miles to study it. They entered temples closed to ordinary people. They learned knowledge that was never meant for the public. Yet when history was written, something changed. Egypt became a footnote, and Greece became the origin. Tonight, we uncover what the Greeks never openly admitted, where their knowledge truly came from, why it was never fully credited, and what ancient Egypt knew long before the world was ready to remember. Stay until the end, because this story changes how history itself is understood. The textbooks love to paint Greece as the sudden spark of civilization. One moment, shepherds were herding goats. The next, Socrates was asking questions so complicated that even goats would have walked away in confusion. But the truth is less dramatic and far more fascinating. Greek thinkers were not conjuring wisdom out of thin air. They were students, curious travelers who packed their sandals, endured long journeys, and humbly entered Egyptian temples to learn from priests who had been guarding knowledge for millennia. Imagine Pythagoras, the man behind the famous theorem, sitting cross-legged in a dim Egyptian hall, listening to priests explain the mysteries of triangles. To the Egyptians, geometry was not abstract math. It was the language of the cosmos, the blueprint of temples, the secret behind aligning pyramids with stars. Pythagoras took notes, returned home, and suddenly Greece had discovered geometry. The irony is delicious. The theorem was less a Greek invention than an Egyptian export, repackaged with a Greek accent. Plato, too, is said to have studied in Egypt. His ideas about the soul, the afterlife, and cosmic order echo Egyptian beliefs about the Ka and Ba, the weighing of the heart, and the eternal balance of Mat. Yet, in the dialogues, Egypt is barely mentioned. Plato's wisdom is presented as uniquely Greek, as though the Nile had never whispered its secrets into his ear. Why did the Greeks downplay Egypt? Pride, perhaps. Or maybe it was simply easier to claim originality than to admit dependence. Greece was rising, eager to shine as the torchbearer of civilization. Egypt, already ancient, was treated as a backdrop, exotic, mysterious, but not credited as the true source. And so the story we were taught became distorted. Greece was celebrated as the origin, while Egypt was reduced to pyramids and mummies. Fascinating but secondary. Yet the monuments remain, silent witnesses to a deeper truth. The Greeks may have polished the story, but Egypt wrote the first draft. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know from where you're watching, whether it's from a cozy bed, a couch with snacks, or hiding under the covers pretending you're studying. I promise, Egypt won't tell on you. The story of Greece is often told as if brilliance appeared overnight. One moment, the world was muddling along with farming and folklore, and the next, Athens was bursting with philosophers who seemed to have invented wisdom itself. It is a flattering tale, but it is also a myth, the myth of sudden Greek genius. Knowledge does not erupt like a volcano. It flows like a river, winding through lands and generations. By the time Greece began to shine, Egypt had already been cultivating wisdom for thousands of years. The Greeks did not stumble upon philosophy in a marketplace. They inherited fragments of a much older tradition, polished them, and presented them as their own. Consider Pythagoras. He is portrayed as a lone thinker, gazing at triangles until inspiration struck. Yet, Egyptian surveyors had been using right triangles to measure land after the Nile's floods centuries earlier. To them, geometry was not abstract theory, but practical necessity. Pythagoras did not invent the triangle. He learned its secrets from Egypt and gave it a Greek name. Or take Hippocrates, hailed as the father of medicine. His writings describe treatments and observations that sound remarkably familiar to anyone who has read Egyptian medical papyri. Honey for wounds, herbs for ailments, surgical techniques, all were practiced in Egypt long before Hippocrates was born. Yet history remembers him as the pioneer, while Egyptian healers are left in the shadows. Astronomy tells the same tale. Greek philosophers loved to debate the heavens, but their models were built upon observations gathered by Egyptian priests who tracked stars with meticulous care. Temples aligned with solstices, pyramids mirrored constellations, and calendars guided agriculture. The Greeks inherited this data, wrapped it in theory, and claimed it as their own. The myth of sudden Greek genius persists because it is tidy. It makes history feel like a story of beginnings, with Greece as the shining dawn. But the reality is more complex. Greece was not the dawn. It was a reflection of a much older light. Egyptian wisdom had been burning for millennia, and Greece carried its flame forward. Long before Athens raised its marble columns or Sparta sharpened its spears, Egypt was already ancient. By the time Greek thinkers began to ask questions about the cosmos, Egypt had been building monuments for millennia, recording knowledge on papyrus, and aligning temples with the stars. To understand Greece, one must first step into the shadow of Egypt, a civilization so old that it seemed eternal, even to the Greeks themselves. Egypt's wisdom was not born from sudden inspiration, but from centuries of observation and practice. The Nile's floods demanded careful measurement, and so mathematics flourished. The vast desert skies invited study, and so astronomy became a sacred science. Illness and injury required remedies, and so medicine was recorded in texts like the Ebers Papyrus, which described treatments ranging from herbal cures to surgical procedures. These were not myths or guesses. They were practical sciences, tested and refined over generations. Temples served as both sanctuaries and schools. Within their walls, priests preserved knowledge in rituals, symbols, and texts. Geometry was used to design sacred structures. Astronomy guided ceremonies, and medicine was tied to spiritual balance. To the Egyptians, science and spirituality were not separate. They were threads of the same tapestry. This integration gave their knowledge a depth that impressed foreign visitors, including the Greeks, who later traveled to Egypt in search of wisdom. The monuments themselves are silent proof of Egypt's mastery. The pyramids, aligned with cardinal points, reveal an understanding of geometry and astronomy that still obelisks carved from single blocks of granite stand as testaments to engineering skill. Even the calendar, based on the rising of Sirius, shows how closely Egyptians observed the heavens. These achievements were not accidents. They were the result of systematic knowledge long before Greece claimed the mantle of genius. When Greek scholars arrived, they encountered a civilization that had already mapped the stars. measured the earth, and healed the sick. Egypt was not a curiosity. It was a library of wisdom written in stone and papyrus. The Greeks admired it, studied it, and borrowed from it. Yet when history was later written, Egypt became the backdrop, while Greece was cast as the origin. To remember Egypt before Greece is to restore balance to the story of civilization. It reminds us that wisdom is ancient, that Greece was a student before it was a teacher, and that the roots of philosophy and science stretch deep into the sands along the Nile. Long before libraries and universities, Egypt's temples were the vaults of wisdom. They were not simply places of worship, but repositories of science, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. To the casual visitor, a temple might have seemed like a grand hall of rituals and incense, but behind the towering columns and sacred statues, priests guarded scrolls, formulas, and observations that had been accumulated over centuries. The Egyptians believed knowledge was sacred, a gift from the gods, and therefore it had to be protected. Temples became the guardians of this treasure. Within their walls, scribes recorded the movements of the stars, the cycles of the Nile, and the remedies for ailments. Geometry was used to design the temple itself, ensuring that its proportions reflected cosmic harmony. Astronomy guided the timing of rituals, aligning ceremonies with solstices and equinoxes. Medicine was tied to spiritual balance, with treatments recorded alongside prayers. Access to this knowledge was not open to everyone. Only the initiated priests, scribes, and chosen students could study the scrolls and symbols. Ordinary people saw the rituals, but not the science behind them. This secrecy ensured that wisdom was preserved, but it also meant that much of it remained hidden from the wider world. When Greek scholars traveled to Egypt, they were astonished to find temples functioning as schools, where knowledge was taught through symbols, myths, and ceremonies. The temples of Heliopolis, Memphis, and Thebes became destinations for seekers of wisdom. Greek visitors entered these sacred spaces, undergoing initiation to glimpse the teachings within. They learned that the temple was not just a building, it was a living textbook. Its architecture, rituals, and inscriptions, all designed to encode knowledge. Every column, every alignment, every carving carried meaning. This preservation of knowledge explains why Egypt seemed timeless. Civilizations rose and fell, but Egypt's temples stood, guarding wisdom through ritual and stone. Even when dynasties changed, the priests continued their work, ensuring that the secrets of geometry, medicine, and astronomy were never lost. To understand Egypt's role in history, one must see the temples not as ruins, but as libraries carved in stone. They were the silent guardians of knowledge, preserving truths that later flowed into Greece and beyond. The Greeks admired them, studied within them, and borrowed from them. But when history was written, the temples were left in the shadows, their role forgotten. To the ancient world, Egypt was not just another kingdom along the Nile. It was a land wrapped in mystery, revered as sacred ground. Travelers from Greece, Phoenicia, and beyond spoke of Egypt with awe, describing it as a place where the divine and the earthly seemed to meet. Its temples were not merely buildings, they were cosmic maps designed to mirror the heavens. Its rituals were not simple ceremonies, they were acts meant to sustain the balance of the universe itself. The Egyptians believed that knowledge was a gift from the gods, entrusted to humanity through figures like Thoth, the divine scribe. To them, wisdom was not something to be debated casually in marketplaces. It was sacred, woven into the very fabric of existence. Every calculation, every observation of the stars, every medical remedy carried spiritual weight. To heal the body was to honor the gods. To measure the land was to preserve cosmic order. To align a temple with the rising sun was to participate in the eternal rhythm of creation. This sense of sacredness impressed outsiders. Greek scholars who visited Egypt found themselves entering a world where science and spirituality were inseparable. They saw priests who were astronomers, healers who were philosophers, and architects who were mathematicians. Knowledge was not divided into disciplines. It was unified under the principle of balance, truth, and harmony. To study in Egypt was not simply to learn facts. It was to undergo initiation into a worldview where wisdom was divine. The monuments reinforced this aura of sanctity. The pyramids, rising from the desert like eternal mountains, seemed less like tombs and more like gateways to the stars. Obelisks pointed skyward, catching the sun's rays as symbols of divine connection. Temples aligned with solstices and equinoxes reminded visitors that Egypt's builders were not only engineers but custodians of cosmic order. For the Greeks, Egypt's sacredness was both inspiring and intimidating. They admired it, studied it, and borrowed from it, but they also struggled to translate its depth into their own culture. In Greece, knowledge became philosophy, stripped of ritual. In Egypt, knowledge remained sacred, guarded by priests and encoded in myth. Egypt was seen as sacred because it treated wisdom not as human invention, but as divine inheritance. And that reverence gave its knowledge a power that echoed across centuries, shaping civilizations long after the Nile's priests had whispered their last secrets. When we picture the great names of Greece, Pythagoras, Plato, Herodotus, we often imagine them as solitary geniuses, pondering beneath olive trees or debating in marble courtyards. Yet many of these thinkers were not content to stay home. They packed their sandals, endured long voyages, and crossed the Mediterranean to study in Egypt, drawn by the reputation of its temples as repositories of ancient wisdom. Egypt was the intellectual magnet of the ancient world. Its priests were astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, and philosophers rolled into one. To the Greeks, Egypt seemed timeless, a civilization already ancient when their own cities were young. The allure was irresistible. If you wanted to understand the cosmos, the soul, or the mysteries of geometry, you went to Egypt. Pythagoras is said to have spent years in Egyptian temples, learning mathematics and the sacred meaning of numbers. His famous theorem may have been inspired by techniques Egyptian surveyors had used for centuries to measure land after the Nile's floods. Plato, too, is believed to have studied in Egypt, absorbing ideas about the immortality of the soul and the balance of cosmic order. Even Herodotus, the father of history, traveled to Egypt, recording its customs and marvels with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. These journeys were not casual sightseeing tours. Greek scholars underwent initiation, learning through rituals, symbols, and coded teachings. Egyptian priests did not hand out scrolls freely. They revealed knowledge gradually, ensuring that students understood its sacred context. For the Greeks, this was both humbling and transformative. They returned home with insights that would shape philosophy, mathematics, and science for centuries. Yet, when these scholars wrote their works, Egypt often appeared only as a backdrop, mentioned briefly or framed as exotic. The depth of Egyptian influence was rarely acknowledged. Greece became the stage, while Egypt remained behind the curtain. The irony is striking. The very thinkers celebrated as the founders of Western philosophy were, in truth, students of Egyptian wisdom. The journeys of Greek scholars to Egypt remind us that knowledge is not born in isolation. It travels, it crosses seas, it is shared and reshaped. Greece's brilliance was real, but it was nurtured in the temples along the Nile, where wisdom had been preserved for millennia before Athens ever dreamed of philosophy. When Greek scholars arrived in Egypt, they quickly discovered that wisdom was not handed out like scrolls in a marketplace. The Egyptians treated knowledge as sacred. An entry into their teachings required more than curiosity. It demanded initiation. To step beyond the outer rituals of the temple and into its inner chambers was to cross a threshold, one that tested both the mind and the spirit. Initiation was not a simple lecture or a casual lesson. It was a process designed to transform the student. Greek visitors were often subjected to symbolic trials, rituals that mirrored the journey of the soul. Darkness and silence were used to strip away distractions, while sacred chants and symbols guided the initiate toward deeper understanding. Knowledge was revealed gradually, wrapped in myth and allegory, so that only those prepared to grasp its meaning could truly learn. The Egyptians believed that wisdom was powerful, even dangerous, if given to the unprepared. Geometry was not just about measuring land, it was about understanding cosmic order. Astronomy was not merely charting stars, it was about reading destiny. Medicine was not simply healing the body, it was restoring balance between the human and the divine. To hand such truths to the uninitiated would be reckless. Thus, initiation served as both protection and preparation. Greek scholars who underwent these rites often emerged profoundly changed. Pythagoras, for example, is said to have spent years in Egyptian temples, absorbing the sacred meaning of numbers. Plato's ideas about the soul and cosmic harmony echo Egyptian teachings that he likely encountered through initiation. These experiences gave Greek philosophy its depth, but the rituals themselves were rarely mentioned in their writings. The Greeks preferred to present the knowledge as their own, leaving the Egyptian context hidden. The secrecy of initiation ensured that Egypt's wisdom remained cloaked in mystery. Outsiders could admire the temples, but only the chosen could enter their inner sanctuaries. This veil of secrecy preserved the sanctity of knowledge, while also fueling its allure. For the Greeks, initiation was both a privilege and a revelation, a journey into a world where science and spirituality were inseparable. The initiation into hidden teachings reminds us that wisdom was never meant to be casual. It was sacred, transformative, and guarded by ritual. The Greeks carried fragments of this initiation back home, reshaping them into philosophy. But the echoes of Egypt's temples lingered in every theorem, every dialogue, every star chart that Greece claimed as its own. In Egypt, wisdom was never treated as casual information to be shared freely. Knowledge was sacred, powerful, and carefully guarded. The priests believed that certain truths were too profound or too dangerous to be placed in the hands of the unprepared. What the public saw were rituals, festivals, and myths. What remained hidden behind temple walls was a deeper science, a body of teachings reserved only for the initiated. This distinction between public and hidden knowledge shaped Egyptian culture. Ordinary people might hear stories of gods and cosmic battles, but within the sanctuaries, priests studied astronomy, medicine, and geometry with precision. They recorded the movements of stars, calculated proportions for monuments, and experimented with remedies for disease. Yet these insights were cloaked in symbols and myth, ensuring that only those trained to interpret them could understand. Greek scholars who traveled to Egypt encountered this divide firsthand. They saw that the wisdom they sought was not displayed openly. To gain access, they had to undergo initiation, proving themselves worthy of the teachings. Even then, what they learned was often encoded in allegory. Numbers carried spiritual meaning, geometry reflected cosmic order, and astronomy was tied to destiny. Knowledge was never stripped of its sacred context. The secrecy served a purpose. The Egyptians believed that wisdom without reverence could lead to misuse. Geometry could build temples aligned with the stars, but in careless hands it could be reduced to mere calculation. Medicine could heal, but without balance it could harm. Astronomy could guide rituals, but without understanding it could become superstition. By guarding knowledge, the priests ensured that it remained connected to the divine. When the Greeks carried fragments of this wisdom back home, they transformed it into public philosophy. They debated geometry in academies, discussed medicine in treatises, and theorized about the heavens in dialogues. Yet the sacred dimension was often lost. What had been hidden knowledge became public discourse, stripped of ritual and mystery. Knowledge not meant for the public reminds us that wisdom was once treated with awe. Egypt preserved it in temples, guarded it with secrecy, and revealed it only to the worthy. The Greeks inherited it, reshaped it, and claimed it as their own. But the monuments still whisper of a time when knowledge was sacred, hidden, and never meant for casual eyes. When the Greeks returned from their journeys to Egypt, they carried with them fragments of wisdom that would shape philosophy, mathematics, and science for centuries. Yet, when they wrote their treatises, dialogues, and histories, Egypt was rarely credited as the source. The question lingers: why did Greece, so proud of its intellectual achievements, choose to downplay the role of Egypt? Part of the answer lies in pride. Greece was rising as a cultural power, eager to present itself as the cradle of civilization. To admit that its greatest thinkers had studied in Egypt would be to acknowledge that Greece was not the beginning but a continuation. Continuations rarely get the spotlight. By minimizing Egypt's influence, Greece could claim originality, presenting its philosophers as pioneers rather than students. Politics also played a role. Egypt was seen as exotic, mysterious, and sometimes threatening. To elevate Egypt as the true source of wisdom might have undermined Greece's cultural identity. By framing Egypt as a backdrop, fascinating but secondary, Greece reinforced its own narrative of superiority. The monuments of Egypt were admired, but their intellectual legacy was quietly overshadowed. There was also the issue of translation. Egyptian knowledge was encoded in symbols, rituals, and myths. When Greek scholars carried it home, they often stripped away the sacred context, reshaping it into public philosophy. Geometry became abstract theory, astronomy became models of spheres, medicine became treatises. In the process, the Egyptian origins were blurred, hidden behind Greek terminology and presentation. Over time, history itself was rewritten. Rome admired Greece, Europe admired Rome, and textbooks admired them all. Egypt was relegated to the role of mysterious antiquity, a land of pyramids and mummies, fascinating but not foundational. The Greeks were celebrated as the fathers of philosophy, while Egypt was remembered only as a curiosity. Why Egypt was rarely credited is not simply a matter of oversight. It was a deliberate shaping of narrative. Greece wanted to be seen as the origin, not the heir. And so Egypt's role was minimized, its wisdom hidden behind Greek names. Yet, silent witnesses to a truth that history tried to forget, that Greece's brilliance was nurtured in the temples along the Nile, long before Athens claimed the stage. Civilizations do not exist in isolation. They inherit, adapt, and transform the wisdom of those who came before. Egypt and Greece are perhaps the clearest example of this truth. The Greeks are celebrated for their philosophy, mathematics, and science, but much of their brilliance was nurtured by the cultural inheritance they received from Egypt. This transfer of knowledge was not theft, but a natural flow of ideas across borders and generations. Egypt had already mastered the sciences of measurement, medicine, and astronomy long before Greece rose to prominence. Its priests recorded the movements of stars. Its scribes calculated proportions, and its healers experimented with remedies. When Greek scholars traveled to Egypt, they encountered a civilization where knowledge was woven into daily life and sacred ritual. They absorbed these lessons, carried them home, and reshaped them into the language of philosophy and theory. The power of cultural inheritance lies in transformation. The Greeks did not simply copy Egyptian wisdom, they reinterpreted it. Geometry, once a tool for measuring fields and designing temples, became abstract theory in Greece. Medicine, rooted in spiritual balance, became a discipline of observation and practice. Astronomy, tied to ritual, became models of spheres and planetary motion. The essence remained Egyptian, but the form became Greek. This inheritance gave Greece its brilliance. Without Egypt's foundation, Greek philosophy might have lacked depth. Greek mathematics might have lacked precision, and Greek science might have lacked data. The Greeks were skilled storytellers, turning practical wisdom into elegant theory. But the roots of their genius stretched deep into the sands of the Nile. Yet history often forgets the power of inheritance. Greece is celebrated as the origin, while Egypt is relegated to the background. The truth is more complex. Greece was the heir, Egypt the ancestor. Civilization is not a series of isolated miracles, but a chain of inheritance, each link forged by those who came before. The power of cultural inheritance reminds us that knowledge is cumulative. Greece carried Egypt's flame forward, reshaping it for a new age. And though Egypt was rarely credited, its wisdom endures in every theorem, every dialogue, and every star chart that Greece claimed as its own. If Egypt had a crown of wisdom, its jewels were writing, mathematics, and geometry. These disciplines were not luxuries, but necessities, born from the rhythms of the Nile and the demands of civilization. Long before Greece carved letters into stone or debated the nature of numbers, Egypt had already mastered the arts of recording, calculating, and measuring. Writing was the foundation. Hieroglyphs were more than symbols. They were a language of ideas, capable of expressing history, law, and ritual. Scribes trained for years to master the art, recording everything from royal decrees to medical recipes. Papyrus scrolls became Egypt's libraries, preserving knowledge across centuries. When Greek scholars encountered this system, they were astonished by its sophistication. Their own alphabet was simpler, But Egypt's writing carried a depth that revealed how knowledge could be preserved and transmitted across generations. Mathematics flourished along the Nile. Each year, the river's floods erased boundaries between fields, forcing Egyptians to recalculate property lines. Geometry was not abstract theory, it was survival. Surveyors used ropes and triangles to restore order, developing techniques that later inspired Greek mathematics. Fractions, equations, and proportions filled papyri, like the Rhind mathematical papyrus, which solved problems with precision centuries before Euclid compiled his Elements. Geometry was sacred as well as practical. Temples and pyramids were designed with astonishing accuracy, their proportions reflecting cosmic harmony. Alignments with stars and cardinal points revealed a union of mathematics and astronomy. To the Egyptians, geometry was not just about shapes. It was about balance, order, and the reflection of divine principles in stone. The Greeks inherited these disciplines and transformed them. Writing became philosophy, mathematics became theory, and geometry became proof. They gave names to principles, formalized equations, and debated abstract concepts. Yet the roots of their brilliance lay in Egypt's practical wisdom, cultivated through centuries of necessity and reverence. Writing, mathematics, and geometry remind us that civilization is built on foundations deeper than textbooks admit. Greece may have polished the ideas, but Egypt had already carved them into stone, recorded them on papyrus, and aligned them with the stars. The monuments still stand as proof that long before Greece claimed genius, Egypt had already mastered the language of knowledge. In Egypt, wisdom was never separated from the sacred. Knowledge was seen as a divine inheritance, entrusted to humanity through gods like Thoth, and preserved in temples through ritual and symbol. To study geometry was not merely to measure, it was to participate in cosmic order. To observe the stars was not simply astronomy, it was to read the destiny of the universe. Medicine was not only healing the body, it was restoring balance between the human and the divine. Every discipline carried spiritual weight, woven into the larger tapestry of Mat, truth, balance, and harmony. This sacred approach meant that knowledge was guarded carefully. Priests revealed teachings only to the initiated, wrapping truths in myth and allegory. Numbers carried mystical meaning, architecture reflected cosmic design, and remedies were tied to prayers. The public saw rituals and festivals, but the deeper sciences remained hidden within temple walls. Knowledge was not meant to be debated casually. It was meant to be revered. When Greek scholars encountered this worldview, they admired it, but also transformed it. In Greece, knowledge became public philosophy. Geometry was stripped of its sacred context and turned into abstract proofs. Astronomy became models of spheres and planetary motion, discussed in academies rather than temples. Medicine became treatises, focused on observation rather than ritual. Philosophy itself became a discipline of debate, where ideas were tested in dialogues and marketplaces. This shift was profound. By removing the sacred dimension, the Greeks democratized knowledge, making it accessible to a wider audience. Yet something was lost in translation. What had been cosmic order became theory. What had been divine inheritance became intellectual discourse. The Greeks carried Egypt's wisdom forward, but they reshaped it into a form that suited their culture: rational, public, and secular. The contrast between sacred knowledge and public philosophy reveals how civilizations interpret wisdom differently. Egypt treated knowledge as divine, guarded by priests and rituals. Greece treated knowledge as human, debated by philosophers and students. Both approaches had power, but together they remind us that wisdom is not only about facts and theories. It is also about meaning, reverence, and the way we choose to honor what we learn. The story of Greece and Egypt did not end with the exchange of wisdom. What truly shaped our modern understanding was how later generations chose to write and rewrite history. Over time, the narrative shifted, polishing Greece into the shining origin of philosophy and science, while Egypt was pushed into the background, remembered more for pyramids and mummies than for its intellectual legacy. This rewriting began with Rome. The Romans admired Greece, adopting its philosophy, mathematics, and art as their own cultural foundation. In doing so, they reinforced the idea that Greece was the birthplace of wisdom. Egypt, though respected for its monuments, was treated as exotic rather than foundational. Roman authors praised Greek thinkers, but rarely acknowledged the Egyptian roots of their ideas. Centuries later, Europe inherited this narrative. During the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered Greek texts, celebrating them as the rebirth of knowledge. Yet many of those texts had themselves been translations of older works, fragments of Egyptian wisdom carried into Greece and then into Rome. The Egyptian context was lost, erased by layers of translation and reinterpretation. By the time these works reached Europe, they appeared purely Greek, stripped of their original source. The Enlightenment further cemented this view. Greece was hailed as the cradle of rational thought, the birthplace of democracy, and the origin of science. Egypt was admired for its monuments, but dismissed as mystical, superstitious, or archaic. The sacred dimension of Egyptian knowledge did not fit the rational framework of modern philosophy, so it was quietly ignored. This rewriting of history was not accidental. It was shaped by cultural pride and political convenience. Greece fit the narrative of progress, a neat origin story for Western civilization. Egypt, with its rituals and sacred knowledge, seemed too foreign, too mysterious, to be credited as the true source. And so the textbooks told a simplified tale: Greece as the beginning, Egypt as the backdrop. Yet the monuments remain, silent witnesses to a deeper truth. The pyramids, temples, and papyri remind us that Egypt was not a footnote, but a foundation. History may have been rewritten, but the stones still whisper of a time when wisdom was sacred, ancient, and far older than the myths of sudden Greek genius. When wisdom travels across cultures, it rarely arrives intact. Egypt's knowledge, preserved in temples and papyri, was carried into Greece through the journeys of scholars and the work of translators. Yet, in the process of translation, much was altered, simplified, or lost. What began as sacred teachings wrapped in ritual and symbol often emerged in Greece as abstract philosophy, stripped of its original depth. Egyptian texts were written in hieroglyphs and hieratic script, languages rich in symbolism. A single sign could carry layers of meaning, spiritual, mathematical, and cosmic, all at once. Translating such complexity into Greek words was never straightforward. Priests spoke in allegories, myths, and rituals, while Greek scholars sought clarity and logic. In the shift from symbol to sentence, nuance slipped away. What had been sacred geometry became mere mathematics. What had been cosmic astronomy became planetary models. The loss was not only linguistic, but cultural. Egyptian knowledge was inseparable from its sacred context. Rituals, chants, and temple alignments gave meaning to the sciences. When the Greeks adopted these ideas, they often removed the ritual, presenting knowledge as rational theory. This made it more accessible to the public, but it also severed the link between wisdom and the divine. What had been a living tradition became intellectual discourse. Later generations compounded the loss. Greek texts were translated into Latin, then into European languages during the Renaissance. Each translation introduced new interpretations, new simplifications, and new distortions. By the time these works reached modern readers, Egypt's role was almost invisible. The wisdom appeared purely Greek, its Egyptian roots buried under centuries of linguistic layers. Even papyri themselves suffered. Many were lost to time, destroyed by decay, or hidden in tombs, never uncovered. What survived often came in fragments, leaving scholars to piece together incomplete puzzles. The monuments still whisper of knowledge, but the scrolls that once explained them are mostly gone. The role of translation and loss reminds us that history is fragile. Wisdom can survive for millennia, yet still be altered by the words chosen to carry it forward. Greece inherited Egypt's knowledge, but translation reshaped it, and time erased much of its origin. What remains is a shadow of the full truth, a reminder that every civilization builds not only on what it learns, but also on what it forgets. Among the many gods of Egypt, none embodied the spirit of knowledge more than Thoth, depicted as a man with the head of an ibis, or sometimes as a baboon. Thoth was not simply a deity of writing. He was the divine keeper of wisdom, the scribe of the gods, and the guardian of truth. To the Egyptians, Thoth was the one who measured the heavens, counted the stars, and recorded the balance of the universe. Thoth's role was vast. He was credited with inventing writing, giving humanity the ability to preserve knowledge across generations. He was the patron of scribes, ensuring that every decree, ritual, and calculation was recorded with precision. He was also the god of mathematics and measurement, overseeing the geometry that aligned temples and pyramids with cosmic order. In medicine, Thoth was invoked as a healer, guiding remedies and restoring balance. In astronomy, he was the one who tracked the movements of the moon and stars, ensuring that rituals aligned with celestial rhythms. But Thoth was more than a scientist or scribe. He was the mediator of divine disputes, the one who weighed truth against falsehood. In the famous Judgment of the Dead, it was Thoth who recorded the outcome as the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma. At his presence ensured fairness, accuracy, and eternal balance. To the Egyptians, wisdom was not only about knowledge, it was about justice, harmony, and truth, and Thoth embodied all three. Greek scholars who encountered Egyptian religion could not ignore Thoth's influence. They saw in him a figure who resembled their own Hermes, the messenger and guide of souls. Over time, Thoth and Hermes were merged into Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, a legendary figure credited with mystical writings that blended Egyptian sacred wisdom with Greek philosophy. These texts, known as the Hermetica, would later inspire philosophers, alchemists, and mystics across the ancient and medieval world. Thoth's legacy reminds us that wisdom was never seen as purely human invention. For Egypt, it was divine, entrusted to humanity through a god who measured the cosmos and recorded truth. By honoring Thoth, the Egyptians acknowledged that knowledge was sacred, eternal, and inseparable from the divine order of the universe. When the Greeks encountered Egypt's god of wisdom, Thoth, they saw a reflection of their own Hermes. Yet Hermes was not simply copied, he was reimagined, reshaped into a figure who embodied both Greek culture and fragments of Egyptian sacred knowledge. This blending of traditions gave birth to a new interpretation, one that would echo through philosophy, myth, and even mysticism for centuries. Hermes, in Greek tradition, was the messenger of the gods, the guide of souls, and the patron of travelers and merchants. He was clever, quick, and resourceful, a god of communication and movement. But when Greek scholars studied in Egypt, they began to associate Hermes with Thoth, the divine scribe who measured the cosmos and recorded truth. The result was a fusion. Hermes was no longer just a messenger. He became a keeper of wisdom, a mediator between the divine and human realms. This interpretation deepened over time. The Greeks began to speak of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, a legendary figure said to have written sacred texts that blended Egyptian ritual with Greek philosophy. These writings, known as the Hermetica, explored themes of cosmic order, the immortality of the soul, and the unity of all things. Though their origins were Egyptian, they were presented in Greek language and style, making them accessible to a wider audience. Hermes thus became more than a mythological character. He became a symbol of hidden wisdom. To philosophers, he represented the bridge between human reason and divine truth. To mystics, he was the guardian of secret teachings. To ordinary Greeks, he remained the familiar messenger god, but beneath that surface lay echoes of Thoth's sacred role. The Greek interpretation of Hermes shows how cultural inheritance reshapes meaning. Egypt's Thoth was a god of cosmic balance, mathematics, and sacred writing. Greece's Hermes was a god of communication and cleverness. Together, they became Hermes Trismegistus, a figure who carried Egyptian wisdom into Greek philosophy, and later into Roman, medieval, and Renaissance thought. By reinterpreting Hermes, the Greeks ensured that fragments of Egypt's sacred knowledge survived, even if Egypt itself was rarely credited. The myths remind us that gods, like ideas, travel across cultures, changing shape but carrying echoes of their origins. Hermes may have worn Greek sandals, but his wisdom walked straight out of Egypt's temples. When Greek scholars carried Egypt's wisdom back across the Mediterranean, they did not simply copy it word for word. They reshaped it, translated it, and adapted it to fit their own culture. In the process, much was changed, but not everything. Some truths survived intact, while others were transformed into something new. Sacred context. In Egypt, knowledge was inseparable from ritual and spirituality. Geometry aligned temples with the stars, astronomy guided ceremonies, and medicine was tied to prayers. The Greeks stripped away much of this sacred dimension, presenting wisdom as rational theory rather than divine inheritance. Language and symbolism. Egyptian teachings were encoded in hieroglyphs, myths, and allegories. When translated into Greek, these symbols became abstract concepts. Numbers lost their mystical meaning, and cosmic balance became philosophical debate. Accessibility. Egypt guarded its wisdom, revealing it only to the initiated. Greece democratized knowledge, turning it into public philosophy. Dialogues, treatises, and academies made ideas available to students and citizens, rather than keeping them hidden in temples. Purpose. For Egypt, knowledge preserved cosmic order. For Greece, knowledge became a tool for argument, exploration, and intellectual progress. The function shifted from sacred preservation to human inquiry. Core principles, the mathematical truths, remained the same. Triangles still measured land, fractions still solved problems, and astronomy still tracked the stars. The Greeks may have rephrased them, but the foundations were Egyptian. Respect for wisdom. Both cultures revered knowledge, even if they expressed it differently. Egypt treated it as divine, Greece as rational, but in both cases, wisdom was seen as the highest pursuit. Influence on civilization. Whether sacred or secular, the teachings shaped societies. Egypt used them to build monuments and sustain rituals. Greece used them to fuel philosophy and science. The impact endured, even if the presentation changed. The story of what was changed and what wasn't reveals the dual nature of cultural inheritance. Greece transformed Egypt's wisdom, but it could not erase its essence. Beneath every theorem, every dialogue, and every star chart lies the imprint of Egypt's temples. The Greeks gave the knowledge new form, but the heart of it remained Egyptian, whispering through history even when the credit was lost. The story of Egypt's wisdom and its transmission to Greece is not just an ancient tale. It is a reminder of how knowledge shapes civilizations and continues to influence us today. Though thousands of years have passed, the lessons embedded in Egypt's temples and carried into Greek philosophy still echo in the way we think, learn, and build. Geometry, astronomy, and medicine, disciplines first cultivated in Egypt, remain central to our world. Every equation solved, every building designed, every star charted carries traces of Egyptian insight. The Greeks refined these ideas, but the roots remind us that modern science is built on ancient foundations. Egypt's influence on Greece shows that civilizations thrive not in isolation but through exchange. Knowledge travels, adapts, and transforms. Recognizing this inheritance challenges the myth of isolated genius and highlights the interconnectedness of human progress. Egypt treated knowledge as sacred, inseparable from truth and balance. While modern science often strips away spirituality, Egypt's example reminds us that wisdom is not only about facts, but also about meaning. This perspective encourages us to see knowledge as more than utility, as something that shapes values, ethics, and our relationship with the universe. For centuries, Egypt's role was minimized, overshadowed by Greece's fame. Revisiting this history matters because it restores balance, giving credit to the civilizations that preserved and transmitted wisdom. By acknowledging Egypt's contribution, we honor the chain of inheritance that built our world. In an age of rapid innovation, Egypt's story reminds us that knowledge must be preserved, respected, and shared responsibly. Just as the priests guarded wisdom to prevent misuse, we too must consider how our discoveries are applied, whether in technology, medicine, or science. Why this knowledge still matters is simple. It connects us to the roots of human thought, reminds us of the sacredness of wisdom, and teaches us that progress is always a collective inheritance. Egypt's temples may be silent now, but their lessons continue to shape the way we live, think, and dream. When civilizations forget where their wisdom comes from, they lose more than credit. They lose perspective. The story of Egypt and Greece is a reminder of how origins can be obscured, reshaped, and even erased, leaving future generations with only fragments of the truth. The cost of forgetting Egypt's role in shaping Greek philosophy and science has been profound, echoing through history and into our present. By presenting Greece as the sole cradle of philosophy and science, history created a simplified origin story. This narrative erased Egypt's contributions, making progress appear as if it sprang suddenly from Athens rather than being nurtured along the Nile for millennia. The distortion fuels myths of isolated genius, ignoring the reality that knowledge is always inherited and shared. Egypt became admired for its monuments, but dismissed as mystical or archaic. Its intellectual legacy was overshadowed, reducing a civilization of profound wisdom to a backdrop of pyramids and mummies. Forgetting origins diminishes respect for cultures that preserved knowledge long before others claimed it. Egypt's worldview treated knowledge as sacred, inseparable from truth and balance. Greece transformed it into public philosophy, stripping away ritual and spirituality. While this democratization made knowledge more accessible, it also severed the link between wisdom and meaning, leaving modern science often disconnected from ethics and reverence. Egypt's careful guardianship of wisdom reminds us that knowledge must be preserved responsibly. Forgetting this origin means forgetting the importance of balance, caution, and respect in how discoveries are applied. In our age of rapid innovation, the absence of this perspective can lead to misuse, exploitation, or shallow understanding of knowledge's deeper purpose. The pyramids and temples still stand, whispering of a time when wisdom was sacred. Yet, without acknowledging Egypt's role, their meaning is reduced to mystery rather than memory. The cost of forgotten origins is not only historical, it is cultural amnesia, a failure to see the continuity of human thought. The cost of forgotten origins is clear. When Egypt's role is erased, we lose the truth of how civilizations grow, how wisdom travels, and how knowledge is preserved. To remember Egypt is to restore balance to history, to honor the chain of inheritance, and to recognize that progress is never born in isolation. It is always the child of forgotten ancestors. As the story of Egypt and Greece unfolds, one truth becomes clear. Wisdom has a lineage. It does not appear suddenly, nor does it belong to one culture alone. Egypt nurtured knowledge for millennia. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and sacred philosophy, and Greece inherited, reshaped, and carried it forward. Yet beneath every theorem, every dialogue, and every myth lies the imprint of Egypt's temples, the whispers of scribes, and the guardianship of priests who treated wisdom as divine. To remember the true source of wisdom is to restore balance to history. It is to acknowledge that Greece's brilliance was real, but it was not born in isolation. It was the heir to Egypt's sacred legacy, a continuation of truths preserved along the Nile. By honoring Egypt, we honor the chain of inheritance that built civilization itself. This remembrance matters because it teaches humility. Knowledge is never ours alone. It is a gift passed down through generations, shaped by cultures we may forget, but whose influence endures. To study geometry today is to walk in the footsteps of Egyptian surveyors. To debate philosophy is to echo the rituals of Egyptian priests. To gaze at the stars is to continue a tradition that began when Thoth himself was said to count the heavens. And so, as we close this journey, we return to Egypt, the true source of wisdom, the sacred ground where knowledge was first revered as divine. Its monuments still stand, silent but eloquent, reminding us that wisdom is older than memory, deeper than history, and eternal in its reach. Now, let the story rest, like the Nile at night, calm and timeless, The temples fade into shadow, the stars wheel overhead, and the echoes of Egypt's wisdom drift softly into dreams. Good night.